The great Greek political philosopher Aristotle, whose Politics and Ethics, two of his most important works we've been discussing, was in some sense the founder of constitutional analysis. He analyzes the nature of political societies and provides a scientific basis for the consideration of constitutions. The Greek word is politeia. It means way of life almost, constitution, set of laws, set of orders, way of ordering political life. And one way to think about the nature of constitutions is this. Think of there being two levels, two orders of law. There are the set of laws that govern a society, the rules which are enforced by the state. But there are a second order of laws. These are rules for making the rules. That second order of lawmaking, those are constitutional laws. And in our own society, in the United States, our Constitution is the governing document that constitutes the federal government in its various branches, limits its powers, say in the Bill of Rights, and those are rules for making rules. And the federal government, through its various mechanisms, then makes the rules that we consider our laws. Now, Aristotle is the first thinker to provide an insightful analysis of the nature of constitutional law, the nature of laws which govern how laws are made. And Aristotle's constitutional analysis is fundamental, and it's worth exploring in a little detail. Aristotle says that there are basically three ways of organizing power. Now, these aren't ideal types, they're not perfect models, but there are three fundamentally different ways to think about how power is organized in a society. He says there's rule by one, there's rule by a few, and there's rule by many. And it's kind of simple, but it's a powerful and insightful way of thinking about analyzing the nature of political institutions. Rule by one, Aristotle says, has two forms. It can either be correct or it can be deviant. And Aristotle says this is true of each of these three kinds of constitution, that there's a correct form and a deviant form. And when he says it's a correct form, he means that it's the rule for the interests of the public, that it's rule for the common good. And when it's a deviant form, that it's a rule for one's narrow interests, that it's a rule for the governing interests, whoever that is. And so Aristotle says when there's rule by one, and that is for the common good, that's called a monarchy. It's a monarchical institution, which invests primary executive and legislative and even judicial authority in a single individual, a monarch, which means rule by one in Greek. When there's a deviant rule by one, it's called a tyranny. And again, that's a Greek word, and it fundamentally reflects the long influence of Greek thought on political science. And so Aristotle says rule by one can be monarchy or it can be tyranny. Rule by the few, Aristotle says, can either be correct, in which case it's an aristocracy, which means in Greek rule by the best. And when it's a deviant rule by the few, that's called an oligarchy, a rule by the few in their own interest. And so the rule by the few can either be the rule by those who are best and will guide the state wisely in the common interest, or deviant, those who rule for their own gain. Finally, he says, constitutions can be organized so that the rule is held by many. And when this works well, when it's a correct constitution, it's called a polity, Aristotle says. And when it's deviant, when you have a deviant set of rule by the many, Aristotle says that is called democracy. And in fact, in Aristotle's schema, the word democracy has negative connotations. And in fact, through much of human history, democracy has negative connotations. And it's interesting to read Aristotle's analysis and to realize that a deviant form of rule by the many is called democracy. This is when the people, the common people, rule in their own interest. That is, they try to transfer the property from the wealthy to themselves, not in the common interest, but in their own interest. But Aristotle does allow that there can be a good form of rule by the many. He just calls it polity. Now, these political categories, these kinds of constitutions, are outlined by Aristotle, and we'll see in future lessons that he's one of the first great political scientists. That is, that he's an empirical scientist. He studies the actual practices and institutions of the Greek world. And in fact, it's thanks to Aristotle's empirical study that we know so much about one of the principal exemplars of ancient democracy, the city of Athens, because either Aristotle or one of his students wrote a work called The Constitution of the Athenians, which described in detail the nature of their democratic organization of power.